I'll be talking about the Indian economy at 75, and I'll start with a little bit of historic backdrop. Through most of human history, India's was the world's largest economy, as far as we know. And I think even well beyond what Angus Maddison looked at. Angus Maddison began at 0, the year of Christ's birth. But if you look at Megasthenes, writing about Chandragupta Maurya, who was called Sandrocotus in the Greek annals, the India he describes was an India that awed him. And of course, the fact that Alexander chose not to go towards the Ganges is also part of because of the army's fear of the 100,000 elephants that the Nandas apparently had. But to go back, the inheritance at independence, India was the world's largest economy until at least 1700, and in fact until 1750. In the year of Christ's birth, India accounted for 32% of world GDP. China was the second largest at 25%. The Roman Empire, all of Europe, essentially the Roman Empire was what we all study in our history and so on. The Roman Empire was 14% of world GDP, and Italy itself was 6.1%. So by the year 1000 CE, India was still 28% of world GDP. China was 24%. And it's worth remembering that this was the era soon after the Gupta Empire, which discovered the decimal system and zero with Brahmagupta. They knew the Earth's circumference almost exactly. They had described gravity 1,000 years or more before Newton's apple moment. Aryabhatta was, of course, one of the key scientists with all of that. It had steel, wood steel, mainly came actually from the Tamil country, but there was trade between the Guptas and them. And then you had Kalidas's poetry. I mean, this was a true golden era of which we know a fair amount. I think there was a golden era under the Mauryas too, which we know less about. In fact, most of the history of the Mauryas was lost. But there was Kalidas's poetry and plays. Panini was writing his grammar. And what is more interesting is that Gurcharan Das has recently told us that he was also writing some great love poetry, and some of it erotic as well. And that was not the only one. Of course, you had Vatsayana's Kama Sutra being written at the same time. So that's in the north and east, but you also had, of course, the Pallavas and their Cambodian cousins. Most of the dynasty that built Angkor Wat were cousins of the Pallavas of the south of India. And then thereafter you had the 5 Pala universities. This is all before 1000 CE. The Palas had 5 universities, not just Nalanda. They had Vikramshila, Odantapuri, Somapura, and Jagadal. 5 of them, each with more than 10,000 students. And most of them had a lot of foreign students from East and West, Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, some Greeks. And there was, in Nalanda, we know that there was a Srivijaya college established by the Buddhist king of Srivijaya that had, at any given time, a dormitory for about 200 to 300 pupils from Srivijaya, which is now Sumatra in Indonesia. So this was 1000 CE. Then, of course, soon after this, in 1025, Rajendra Chola first conquered the Pala realms in the north. He conquered the Palas, Dharmapala, and renamed himself Gangaikonda Chola, having captured the Ganga. And then he went and he was invited by the enemies of Srivijaya to conquer what is now Sumatra, and he did, and Sumatra and Malaysia, and this was 1025. So that was just after 1000 CE. By 1700, India still accounted for 24.5% of world GDP. China was still second at 22.3. And through almost all of this period, India was the world's clothier and always a huge trading power. So having lived in Southeast Asia, one became so aware of India's abiding and deep influence right across what we think of as ASEAN today. I mean, there was what is today Vietnam, for most of its history, had a Hindu kingdom called Champa from 192 CE until, it lasted until 1820, although those last 300 years they were Muslim. Most of them had converted to Islam. But that Champa kingdom lasted that entire period of time. So India's influence spread east and west as well. But I don't want to get into too much of that. So in 1708, Daniel Defoe, the novelist who wrote Robinson Crusoe, spoke about how Indian cloth was ubiquitous. Everywhere you look, we have Indian stuff, whether it's in our bed linens, our curtains, our underwear, very important, because until then, Europe only knew wool. So they had no underclothing. They just wore wool on their bare bodies. It was very scratchy. The lives of Europeans improved dramatically once they began to trade with India. And of course, most of this trade initially, in that first 100 years after the Europeans began to arrive, when Vasco da Gama found the sea route to India. Why did he need a sea route to India? Because the Ottomans had just conquered Constantinople, which was the old Eastern Roman capital. And so they needed a route around. And so Vasco da Gama arrived in Kozhikode and met the Zamorin, as he called him, the Samutri Raja of Kozhikode. Anyway, now, in 1708, already India's cloth in particular was ubiquitous across Europe and increasingly was fanning trade with Africa and so on. Now, it's interesting that one of the earliest British governors of Madras was called Elihu Yale. He was governor of Madras for 5 years. This was long before the British had reached Calcutta and the Battle of Plassey of 1757. He was governor of Madras from 1687 to 1692. And he made so much money as governor of Madras that he established a college in New Haven, Connecticut, where my daughter has just gone to study, Yale University. So he made enough money there. Now, his successor, but one, was a man called Thomas Pitt. Thomas Pitt was governor of Madras for 10 years. During those 10 years, he made such a fortune that he bought 3 seats in the British House of Commons, and he established a dynasty that came to dominate English politics, British politics, in the next century. Produced 2 prime ministers, Pitt the elder and Pitt the younger. And one of his other descendants was the man after whom the city of Pittsburgh in the US is named as well. So these were all fortunes being made from trading with India in the 17th century, before Britain's empire really began. But interestingly, in 1705, the British decided to ban all imports of cloth from India. This was 55 years before the British Industrial Revolution began. So for 55 years, they had a complete ban so that they could protect Lancashire and get the textile industry going. And yet, in economic history as taught in Western universities, this is somehow elided. It's missing. But at any rate, it took more than 50 years for Britain's Industrial Revolution to begin. And by 1820, India's share, of course, before 1820, you had 1757. The British Empire really began after the Battle of Palashi in 1757, and then the Battle of Buxar was probably even more important. But thereafter, 1757, another 63 years later, in 1820, Britain still had an 80% import tariff on Indian cloth to protect Lancashire. So initially it was a ban. The ban was replaced by a tariff, but the tariff was still 80%. So even 60 years after the Industrial Revolution had begun, Indian textiles and cloth were still far more competitive than Lancashire's was. So by 1900, India's share of world GDP was down to 8.6%. China was then 11.1%. And by 1950, it fell to 4.2%. And China's then was 4.6%. But to me, the real disgrace is that India's share continued to fall and fell further to 3.2% in 1980, by when China's was 5.2%, and it rose just a little bit to 4% in 1990. So it was 4% in 1990, less than half of India's share of world GDP in 1900. And today, India's share of world GDP has recovered slightly to 7.5%, still below where it was in 1900. So we can start thinking about ourselves as a superpower, but we are still quite a long way from being that. So that is the backdrop. That is the historic inheritance. Now, I'll start by taking a look at India's experience with growth since independence, or since India got dominion status. And what is noticeable is a trend acceleration over time. So the red lines there are actual annual real GDP growth each year. But notice that after every decade or so, you get a year of recession. Now, that first recession was 1957-58, fiscal year 57-58. That occurred not coincidentally. It occurred within a year of the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956, which basically reserved almost the entire economy for the public sector. And this, to my mind, was a serious error. And if you look at the chart on the right, the shaded areas here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The shaded periods are the periods during which India was under IMF tutelage. So every decade or so, there was one balance of payments crisis. India had to turn to the IMF. And usually, when it turned to the IMF, Nehru or later Indira would appoint Morarji Desai as finance minister. Now, Morarji Desai now has a reputation for all the wrong things, but he was a remarkably good finance minister. The 9 years that he presented the budget, India's real GDP grew 5%. He was simply a person who insisted on fiscal rectitude. And he restored rectitude after a little bit of profligacy with the start of the second five-year plan and the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956. Now, here, this orangish gold line is the 10-year moving average. Note that the 10-year moving average keeps going up. Then, of course, there's this 2020 downturn, which is not a balance of payments downturn. As you can see on the right, there was no balance of payments crisis. In fact, there was a current account surplus in that year. But This was, of course, the COVID-related crisis. And this was the single worst year in India's economic history in terms of GDP. Well, if you have a 2-month complete lockdown of the economy, you're not going to be able to do much with growth that year. And so that spoils the picture of trend acceleration. But I think trend acceleration will be quickly restored because, first of all, the balance of payments are in fine shape, and second, the investment to GDP ratio. Now, if you look at the first couple of plans, the main focus was that India's savings rate was really low. Savings rate was 5% of GDP. You needed to raise that. And indeed, we succeeded, and especially we succeeded here. If you look at from 2002 or so onwards, there was a huge surge in the savings and investment rates, and that has ensured that the acceleration in GDP occurs. So there hasn't really been too much of a setback to the investment rates, so that should ensure that we'll get a pretty decent recovery as we go forward. Okay. Now, the other chart on this page shows per capita income growth. The previous one was actual GDP growth, and this one is per capita income. And I've got five-year moving averages for that as well. The best happens to be the best 5 years of any prime minister's term was the first Modi term, slightly better than the first Manmohan Singh term as prime minister. About 6.2% annual growth in per capita income. This second term is, of course, going to be a lot worse than that, but that was. Now, of course, the second term for Manmohan Singh was also much weaker. Now, what has helped a lot, of course, is that the external balances fundamentally improved post-1991. Before 1991, each of those, there were those 6 occasions when you had balance of payments crises that forced India to go to the IMF. And the biggest of those, let me just show you again, the biggest IMF program of all actually was this one, in 1981. In 1981, that lasted 3 years, and that 1981 program was the largest loan made by the IMF until that point. It was $5 billion. It was the largest loan ever taken by any country. And typically the IMF does not lend unless you undertake some important reforms. And of course, the reforms that occurred in 1981 were fairly modest, and they were in fact a continuation of some reforms that were undertaken by Morarji Desai when he was Prime Minister. During the 2-year Desai Prime Ministership, India's real GDP grew 6.7% on average for 2 years. This is again an untold story, but I think he is a bit of an unsung hero of India's economic performance. And those modest, market-oriented reform, modest, very modest, but all that was needed was modest reform, and it accelerated growth in the 1980s quite significantly. But of course, that led to another, the last of the balance of payments crises. There were two IMF programs in succession. One was in early 1991. It was only $670 million of a loan from the IMF. And then the IMF was not willing to lend anymore. Then, of course, you had the famous episode of gold having to be mortgaged in order to obtain the second IMF loan. But of course, before that, you had a dramatic transformation with the 1991 reforms, for which P.V. Narasimha Rao deserves huge credit. Now, the external sector was fundamentally transformed. And this chart on the right, I hope you can see it. It's a very busy chart. But what it shows is the gray line here is India's goods exports. Goods exports in the year 1991 were 18.5 billion US dollars. Last year, they had risen to 429 billion, went from 18.5 to 429. And services, broadly defined, this is invisibles. Invisibles went from 9 billion, 8.99 actually, in 1991 to 369 billion last year. So went from 9 to 300, so a 41-fold increase over a 30-year period. And if you look at both goods and services together, the increase in exports of goods and services is 29-fold over that 30-year period. And if you look back in history, every economy that has ever emerged and succeeded and industrialized, use any word that you will, has basically done it through exports. For the simple reason that the world economy is many times larger than the domestic economy. And so the fundamental problem with India's approach prior to 1991 was that all the models looked upon India as a closed economy, and that entered the mindset. It is mind-boggling to think that there was a complete 100% ban on imports of all consumer goods. No other country did this. Complete ban on all imports of consumer goods. There was extensive import tariffs on pretty much everything. And of course, on top of that, there was industrial licensing. Licensing was required for any expansion of capacity, any change in product mix. I mean, it was a ridiculous system, but fortunately, it was all shelved in 1991. And since then, the dynamism of the economy has been driven to a large extent by exports. Now, I'll now take you to one set of problems that has beset the economy, and not just India's economy, but the world economy over the past 10 to 12 years. And that is that if you look at this chart on the left, I show you that through, I'm from 1990 to 2010 on that chart. The red line is global real GDP growth. The blue line is global trade volume growth each year. And except in a global recession year, you'll find that global trade grows at least 1.5%, 1.5 times as fast as global GDP, at least. And in many years, it grows 2 to 3.5 times as fast as global GDP. And this is true not only from 1990 to 2010 as shown on that chart, but the same was true all the way back to 1945. But something remarkable happened here. In 2011, this stopped. And for the subsequent decade, global trade was growing slightly less than global GDP, except in 1 year, 2017. And that was the first year of the Trump presidency. And one thing happened when Trump became president. That 1 year, China began to allow the renminbi to appreciate. It appreciated about almost 11% against the US dollar. And China sucked in a lot more imports, and world trade grew 1.5 times the pace of world GDP in 2017. That was a lovely bribe to Donald Trump. It took Trump 2 years before he began to realize that, I better take some action to curtail Chinese trade. But anyway, he had the right instinct. I'll show you in a moment that his instinct was right on that. So the reason, now I'll come back to this in a moment, but let me just take you back to why this is. My view is that China's overinvestment over the past 25 years has caused the so-called investment drought in the rest of the world. In the Western media and in academia, there's been a lot of talk about the global investment drought. The first person to talk about it was Ben Bernanke when he was Fed chairman. He also called it a global savings glut. But really, the nub of the problem is China, and this is where none of the academic or media literature hits the nub of the problem, and that is here. So if you look here, this chart compares investment spending in several of the major economies of the world in 2021, last year, to 25 years earlier, 1996. In China, the increase is 1,717% over a 25-year period. In these four, in Indonesia, Singapore, US, Taiwan, four very diverse economies, the increase over 25 years is very modest. The compound annual growth rate for those three is about 3%, give or take 0.1 percentage point over a 25-year period. India is slightly better off. India's increase over that time is about, the CAGR is about 8%. The European Union has a CAGR of 1.4%. So there's been a drought of investment spending in the rest of the world, and there's been a massive surge in investment spending in China. I will show you in a moment that these two are closely related, and in fact, China's overinvestment is causing the drought in the rest of the world. First reason is, if you look at money supply, this thing has moved a little bit, but yeah. So if you look at, oh dear, something's happening to the presentation. Anyway, maybe I'm moving it forward and back too often. Now, if you look at this, this is China's money supply. Prior to the global financial crisis, in August 2008, exactly 14 years ago, China's broad money supply, or M2, was $6.56 trillion. Now it is 40 trillion US dollars. So that is more than a five-fold increase over a 14-year period. You compare that to the United States has seen an increase of only 180%. We all have been hearing about money printing in the US going berserk, etc. But actually, most of the money has flowed to China, and China has built on it and has had the biggest monetary expansion in world history. And it has used that monetary expansion to finance this enormous increase in investment. Now, unfortunately, the chart on the left has vanished. Anyway, I don't need it so much. The chart on the table on the right, the reason I really want to focus on this is to demonstrate that what China has had is causing the investment drought in the rest of the world. So, if you look at this, the chart on the right shows you 2021, last year's production in several key industries. In steel, China last year produced 1,033 million tons of steel. World steel production was 1,950 million tons. If you go back to the year 2000, world steel production in the year 2000 was 840 million tons, of which China accounted for 128 million tons. 128 is already the largest production by any country in any given year until that point. The highest that other countries had reached was just short of 125 million tons. So China was at a world record 128 million tons in 2000. By 2021, it had gone to 1,033 million tons. The rest of the world's production, therefore, went from 712 million tons in the year 2000 to 917 million tons. So there was just a 205 million ton increase in the rest of the world's annual production. In China, there was an increase in annual production of over 900 million tons. And the same is true for aluminium, cement, cars, etc. Now, why is this happening? Because in the year 2003, in June 2003, China had the mother of all banking crises, except that none of us has ever heard of it. Standard & Poor's, the rating agency, put out a report in June 2003 saying that the NPLs in the Chinese banking system were at 50%. Now, if you have half the loans in the banking system not even being serviced, that is, even the interest on the loans is not being paid, the banking system is beyond bust. If you get to 20% NPLs, your banking system usually is finished. If you get to 50%, you're way beyond redemption. And what did China do? Well, China turned to some of the world's great investment banks. First of all, it made that S&P report vanish in 48 hours. The only trace of it, and I will, if you ask for it, I will send you that trace. The only remaining trace of it is a Wall Street Journal report mentioning the S&P report. That's the only trace that exists. And I check on its existence every few months, and it's still there. I mean, it was there until a week ago, at least. So that's the only proof. Now, what did China do? It took 45% of banks' loans and just removed them from banks' books. Then it turned to Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, HSBC, Temasek, and asked them to invest in these so-called cleaned-up Chinese banks. They did. The Chinese banks were recapitalized. They took these strategic investors took 10 to 12% stakes, and then these so-called cleaned-up banks were offered to the public, and global capitalism rescued China's communist banks, which were bust. They did IPOs, and many of us then bought into their IPO, and the banks were effectively recapitalized. So they paid no price for the bad lending of the past. Moral hazard was deepened, and they continued to lend as if there's no tomorrow. And I think the rest of the world should not have been trading with China as if it was a normal economy. But unfortunately, it's already happened, and the consequences are now with us because there is, China's overcapacity has now become a global problem of overcapacity. And if you look at this, the other point here is the second biggest steel producer in the world now is India, aluminium, India, cement, India. But look at the second biggest producer produces just about a tenth or about 1/9 of what the biggest producer does. And this dichotomy has never existed. At the height of Japan's dominance, Japan was dominant in export markets, but it wasn't dominant in industrial capacity to anything like this extent. And this is in old industries. In some of the new industries, electric vehicles, about half of world production is in China. In solar panels for photovoltaic cells for solar panels, 70 to 80% of world production is in China. So if there's an industry where you can throw money at an industry and develop capacity, China has dominated it. I mean, there are, of course, a few areas where it isn't as dominant, semiconductors being one. But now look at India's number. India this year will be over 125 million tons. Remember that holy grail of 125 million prior to 2000. India will be there this year. But there is still a very wide gap between India and China. Now, the other interesting thing, if you looked at recent data from 5 minutes, look at recent data out of China. China's trade surplus in the year to date this year is it's $482 billion. But in the year to date, China's foreign reserves are down by $150 billion. So even though, and the interesting thing is that China's foreign reserves peaked in 2014. June 2014 is when they reached 3.99 trillion, and they've been declining since, so they've been flat basically since 2016. And this year they're declining. So essentially, China has now reached the point where the locals know that there is a lot of muck in the system, and the locals, especially Chinese Communist Party members, are the first to take their money out. China has very tight capital controls, and yet there's massive capital flight occurring. So, some of my charts are messed up here. Anyway, that is an important backdrop for the period ahead, because as India begins to grow more rapidly now, the major challenge is going to be from China, not just for India, but for the whole world. As I pointed out, the whole world is feeling the impact of China's overinvestment, and India too will be confronting that. But I would argue that China has reached the end of the road for its overinvestment and export-driven growth model. It confronts an overcapacity problem, not only in industry, but also in real estate. And we have a slow-motion financial crisis now in China. Now, what is interesting is that in the past year and a half, again, for the first time since 2010, global trade is growing a lot faster. It's growing about twice as fast as global GDP. And India is riding that wave. Until last month, India's export growth was nearly 42% in 2021. In the first half of 2022, it was 24%. And then India shot itself a bit in the foot by imposing export duties on steel and petroleum products, two of India's largest export items. And suddenly, in July, export growth slowed to 2% because steel exports slumped. Steel, again, that product keeps coming back. India is the second biggest producer. Interestingly, this year to date, world steel production is down. Of the 10 biggest steel producers in the world, 9 are seeing their production decline this year. The only one still growing its production is India. So there's a great opportunity for India to really start taking the baton in terms of growth as China slows down and faces its financial crisis. But we shouldn't have too many self-goals. We are very good at self-goals, unfortunately, and we have a little bit of one there again. Okay, unfortunately, a lot of my charts are a little bit messed up. Now, anyway, so my basic point then is, has India become more protectionist? I mean, there's a lot of talk in the press about India now returning to the pre-1991 era of protectionism. This is really rubbish. This chart shows you India's average tariff, that is, customs duty as a percent of imports, and that number has declined over time. The Modi government did see an increase. Soon after the Modi government came to power, in the first couple of years, there was a slight increase, but very marginal increase from about 4.5% to 6%. But the effective total tariff rate is now back down to about 4%. So there's been no real increase in protectionism. There has been strategic moves to protect certain sectors, particularly from Chinese competition. And this is now a global phenomenon. We saw that with the Trump administration. The Biden administration has not changed that approach to China. And this has to happen in the rest of the world because we cannot have classic dumping. If you're producing and exporting below the cost of production, that is called dumping in international trade. And that's what China does. It needs to be curtailed. So now, where do we stand now? I mean, as an economy, as I said, our share of world GDP is still only 7.5%. Where I think India has had some success is in steel, aluminum, cement, cars. Cars, India is the 5th largest producer in the world. Oil refining, India is the 5th biggest producer of refined petroleum products. Where we, of course, have major weaknesses as a country are, first of all, our huge dependence on imported oil. So to the extent that we can move away from fossil fuels, the quicker we can do that, the better for us. But the other aspect is where we have missed the East Asian boat of economic development is in labor-intensive manufacturing. The first thing that Japan, for instance, did, I mean, my first book is a paean to Japan. I have no qualms about saying that Japan is a remarkable example that most of Asia should try and emulate, and it did it mainly as a democracy. And the first thing that they did was universalize literacy. Japan had universal literacy by 1900. Even at the time of the Meiji Restoration in 1868, literacy in Japan was close to 3/4. Most of Japan could read and write. We are today, or at least 10 years ago, we were where Japan was in 1868. Now, we don't know what the literacy rate is. Now, it seems to be picking up, but there is still substantial illiteracy in India. At independence, of course, we had 14% literacy. So that was, again, the other aspect of the inheritance. I think that's a real failure, that we don't have universal literacy yet. But the other real failure, to my mind, is the fact that we have not ridden the wave of labor-intensive manufacturing. So India did everything to eliminate the multi-fiber arrangement under which textiles and garments was traded until 1994, under the old GATT arrangements. That was to be dismantled in 1994 over the subsequent 10 years. The point was that instead of quotas, textile and garment trade would be open to normal competition. India had been arguing for this for 30 or 40 years and finally got it done. And guess what? India failed to take advantage of it. All of the benefit went initially to China and then to Vietnam and Bangladesh recently. So we definitely need to address that. India has done some of this. India has reformed its labor laws, dramatic reformation of the labor laws, including introducing a contract labor law, which basically allows for fixed-term contracts for new workers. That essentially gets around most of the inflexibility in the labor market. This law was passed in September 2020, signed by the president the following month, but it hasn't been notified yet. India is a remarkable country where you have little time bombs all over the place. There was a law called the Benami Transactions Abolition Act, passed in 1988, September 1988. It was not notified. That means it didn't become actual law until September 2016. Now, unfortunately, with the labor laws, they've been passed. The president has signed them. They're officially the law of the land. But no, they haven't been notified yet. So somebody has to urge some bureaucrat to notify the law and make it the law of the land. And of course, several states are effectively implementing the transformed labor laws, but that is really essential if India is to have the transformative employment revolution that is the key to getting onto the path of rapid economic growth with equity, which was really the East Asian example set by Japan and emulated by Taiwan and Korea. So I'll stop there so that Narayan can put me through the grinder. Thank you so much for listening.
So thank you, PK, for that. We go back a long ways, as he said right at the beginning. In fact, it sort of marks time when we think that more than half of the 75 will sort of live together,
Right.
Particularly in the Indian context. So, real pleasure to be chatting with you today. I'm actually not going to speak too much about what you put up on screen. I'm going to use a model, and then we can go through each of the aspects of that model, and then I'd love to get your reaction. So, since you said that development, we can borrow lessons from lots of countries, and most particularly the countries in East Asia, I'm going to create this model of a house. Sujata is here, so I'm going to use a design element of a house here. And this has sort of a few horizontal foundational elements. Let's call it, say, primary education, for instance, infrastructure, stable macroeconomy. And then it has, the classic pillars upon which the house is built, such as, for instance, the savings investment model, such as the institution. So what I'd like to do is ask questions about this house, and it will pertain to your conversation here, and importantly, I think, link to the future rather than where we've come from. So my first question is this. Many economists now observe that the strong savings rate that India enjoyed in the first decade of the 2000s, which was 37-38% of GDP, has now declined. And the East Asian model suggests that savings is a necessary but not sufficient condition for investment. And particularly if savings declines, that is a dangerous condition for investment. Number one. Number two, that investment in India sort of stalled after 2017, which was the last globally synchronous economic growth year. So where are we on this sort of solo, to use an economic term, Robert Solow, savings investment model?
Well, the real slowdown was in 2011-12. That is when you had a little bit of a dip. And as a consequence, you had a much larger current account deficit. The current account deficit reached 5% of GDP in 2013. So essentially, that is investment being higher than savings, and you get a current account deficit. And now, as I pointed out, if you look at my chart, the savings and investment rates are lower than they were in the period from about 2005 to 2008. But they're still around 32 to 34%, which is adequate. To my mind, the countries that ran into trouble had much higher savings rates and actually not so much savings rates as investment rates. So if you look at Thailand in the period before the Asian financial crisis, Thailand had a savings rate of about 36%, but its investment rate went to 46% at the peak, 45% at the peak. And China has had an investment to GDP ratio of over 43, 44% for about 12 years.
So building the white elephant.
Too much investment is also not a good thing. I think India's savings rate is adequate. If it's a little bit higher, that'll be helpful. But a developing economy, emerging developing economy, does not need to have a current account surplus. A modest current account deficit is fine.
So what explains the anemia in private sector investments?
Well, simple. In the Indian case, there was a tremendous investment boom and a lending boom in the first UPA term. The first UPA term, loan growth was averaged over 5 years, 26%. The second UPA term, it averaged about close to 19%. So you had a decade of over 20% average annual lending growth, which is basically what the Asian financial crisis was about. Asian financial crisis was around 25% annual growth for 10 years. India had about 22, 23% growth on average for 10 years. So India got close to a balance of payments crisis in 2013. And so, you had the classic, what is called the twin deficit problem, twin balance sheet problem. You had balance sheet crisis in the banks and a balance sheet crisis in the corporates. And the corporates have essentially used the last 7 or 8 years to deleverage. If you look at India's bank loan growth over the past 8 years, the average loan growth is 9%. That is a nominal growth rate. And inflation has averaged about close to 6. So real loan growth is 3%. There's very little actual lending growth in India. As a result, this growth that India's had over the past 8 years is deleveraged growth. It is now. Today, I think the corporate sector is in much better shape.
Yeah. So is the deleveraging over, and then what makes for India's investment to come back?
Well, I think we have the first very tentative signs of a recovery. At the moment, the July number for loan growth in India is 14.5%. That is the best since 2012 or so. So we've had a little bit of a pickup. After a decade of extreme sluggishness in bank lending, we're beginning now to see a pickup. So if you look at the corporate sector, it is substantially deleveraged. There's been very little scope for taking on new debt. So ironically, the rest of the world was taking on a lot of debt. China in particular was taking on a lot of debt. India was deleveraging, the corporate sector particularly. The banks were effectively reducing their exposure to leveraged corporates. And of course, you had the bankruptcy code helping to clear some of the bad debt out of the system. So all of that has helped, and I think India is now on the cusp of a turnaround. I mean, we're seeing us, we are in the midst of that turnaround.
So India is not going to be like Brazil, where it's always better tomorrow than today?
No, it's better now, not tomorrow. And also, I mean, Brazil never got to second highest producer of steel, aluminum, and cement.
So that's the first pillar. Let me switch to the second pillar, which is the one on institutions. Once again, there's lots of discussion in circles about institutions being weakened by political interference and sort of lack of let's call it independence to function in the manner that they would. Perhaps the Monetary Policy Committee is an example of something that is not one of those, but there are many other examples of actual interference. So the Acemoglu idea that institutions are very important to the development of a country once again points to possible difficulty for India.
Yeah, very good and interesting question. And with regard to institutions, I think India has a lot of relatively strong institutions, much stronger than many East Asian countries had at a similar stage. Now, one of them is perhaps the Supreme Court. Now, is the Supreme Court a strength for India or a weakness? I would say it is a very mixed picture. And most important, I mean, the Supreme Court is interfering in fiscal policy. The outgoing Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has an opinion about freebies. Where in the world does a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court have opinions about fiscal policy? That's not his business. Anyway, now the point is, where India's institutions lack on the judiciary is that the judiciary, I think, has a real problem with the delivery of justice. And I think that's a weakness in many ways. I mean, one of the most striking things to me is that the Supreme Court and the High Courts function in only one language, and that is English. You and I are speaking the colonial language too. I'm ashamed to say that I speak better English than Bengali, my mother tongue. Unfortunately, that helps us to argue in the Supreme Court. But 90% of India's people don't speak English, and yet English is the only language in which the judiciary functions. And that's, I think, part of the reason why the judiciary is so bad at delivering justice. So that's one aspect. Now, we could go on about this, but...
No, but I'm going to focus the point not on India's long post-colonial history, but the last 10 years.
Really, I mean, even now, I mean, the backlog of cases, et cetera, is ridiculous. And that is what needs to be addressed, I think, more than anything else. The independence of the judiciary, I think, is very much in place. In fact, if anything, our judiciary has far too much independence, much more than the United States, for instance. I mean, the judges get to appoint themselves. But if you go back, I think one of the problems is that the discourse that we have about things like justice is very partisan. We have a very partisan, and the fact that it's partisan, the fact that there's so much criticism, is, I think, a sign of a vibrant democracy. Now, if you look at the First Amendment, I think most people don't realize that the First Amendment to the Constitution in India curtailed fundamental rights, curtailed the right to speech and expression. And it was passed before the first election. Now, in the US, the First Amendment was the Bill of Rights. In India, the First Amendment curtailed the Bill of Rights.
We won't get to the US Second Amendment, but that's okay.
So the point is, thankfully, we don't have that. But you see, this has a long history, and some of it is less well known, but it's not as if the independence of the judiciary has been reduced now. If anything, from 1993, when India had a relatively weak government, the judiciary essentially took control of its own. Now, just on that point,
So, but I'm going to extend it beyond judiciary. So if we add SEBI, RBI, Election Commission,
Yeah.
arms of enforcement, the CAG, et cetera, et cetera. So the entire set of institutions, both formal and informal, you're sanguine about institutions on average being positive as opposed to being, you're almost speaking about the opposite way. You're saying that
I
political influence is a positive on institutions. Am I
there has to
reading
be some,
you correctly?
I mean, in all democracies, there's political influence on the
But
institutions.
it has to be structured political
But
influence.
some institutions, so India has a range of regulatory institutions, SEBI, TRAI, telecoms, etc., IRDAI, which are relatively autonomous, the Election Commission. These are all relatively autonomous. And when you compare it to the rest of the world, I think they're far better run than others. Now, of course, we now have this, this SEBI scandal about the so-called Himalayan guru and all of this stuff. That is a little bit of an aberration.
Yeah,
I mean, you have these aberrations along the way, but broadly speaking, I think SEBI has been a very effective regulator of the capital markets. There are exceptions. I mean, one wonders about the accounting of Reliance and Adani. There are problems with certain,
Business
houses, etc.
Okay.
But it's not much worse. It's nowhere near as bad, for instance, as Korea, say prior to the Asian financial crisis, or actually, Japan generally is better. Japan is pretty well regulated, but we aren't too much worse.
Let me switch to the third pillar, which is jobs and employment. I mean, politically and economically, jobs are job one, as they say. And yet, again, there is much, I think statistically weak, but much argument about there being no jobs in that line that you showed going upwards.
Yeah.
One, is it true that there are no jobs in that line going upwards? And two, how can we then be complacent about our growth if there are no jobs?
First of all, there are jobs, of course. There are jobs, and there is a very vibrant welfare state that has emerged, I'd say over the last 15 years. Not just this administration, even the last one. The last one used, perhaps the second UPA term, the nature of the welfare delivery was less market-oriented, and therefore, it made things a little bit worse. But we've had a huge improvement in welfare delivery. So that is positive. But what is required, clearly, is for employment to get a significant leg up. And primarily what has to happen is large-scale, labor-intensive manufacturing, which is the missing piece of India's growth story.
You should just get your questions ready. I'm going to switch in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, and I just say one, in terms of the statistical question of are there jobs? Yes, there are. I mean, if you look at things like the Provident Fund data, that continues to show a substantial increase, very, very substantial increase in organized sector jobs. But the problem is the unorganized sector. So we have basically an organized sector that has the panoply of labor protections that a developed economy has, perhaps excessive amounts of protection. And then we have, I'd say, 90% of the labor force in the unorganized sector with absolutely no support or labor protections at all. And ironically, our labor laws are aimed for the 10% and they ignore the 90%. So what's required is for a convergence of the two. And I think the new labor laws go a long way towards that. They've also introduced a pension scheme for the unorganized sector, which is beginning. They've got the Ayushman Bharat universal health system effectively now in place. So a lot of positives, but what we really need is labor-intensive manufacturing on a grand scale, and to occur in basically North India in particular, where you have a huge amount of potential surplus labor that generally just migrates either for agricultural work in Punjab or to the slums of Mumbai, etc., to work in very basic unorganized work. So that is where India is missing the boat to a large extent, and I think that's
so let me ask the last question then. It's a sort of a compound question between a horizontal and vertical in my creation, which is, if you read the Assar report on Indian education, it's scary, to say the least. So primary education, which is a horizontal, leaves something to be desired. And if you move that to middle school, secondary school, and then higher education, is India heading headlong into a middle income trap where, because the pipeline that took Korea 25 years, Japan 20 years, China these 25 years, we're certainly not prepared to get out of that 15, 20 years from now. So if you, to use the phrase that's become common now, look at India at 100, are we setting ourselves up to become more a Malaysia and a Mexico rather than a China or a Japan or a Korea?
I don't mind being a Malaysia 25 years from now. I don't mind being Malaysia or Mexico. I mean, Mexico, less so, perhaps. I mean, Mexico has had quite a few problems. But with Malaysia, for instance, having lived there, Malaysia has universal employment. There's no unemployment of locals. So that's not a bad outcome. But Malaysia had a significant period of labor-intensive manufacturing, followed by labor-intensive manufacturing of electronics. So that's not a bad outcome. I would agree that Malaysia is now in the middle income trap, but it's not such a bad trap. So it's not a bad outcome to have. But what I would, of course, prefer is if we went more the Korea way, the Taiwan way, now.
Wouldn't that require R&D and innovation,
yeah,
which is then built on at least primary education, but certainly beyond that as well? And then you get into the structure of India's research,
yes,
which still is the only country, even after the Soviet Union has given it up, to follow a lab model of research.
Yeah. So, okay.
There's too many. There's a compound question, so I'm going to
let me quickly
just leave that with you.
Let me address some of that quickly.
Yeah.
First of all, I think in terms of primary education, we have a gap that cannot be easily fixed, and that is that India only introduced universal and compulsory primary education in the year 2001. It's remarkable. I mean, that it took so long for that to happen. But as a result, despite the fact that most schools don't have teachers, etc., the new generation is literate. It is literate, they can read and write, and they have basic numeracy. It is better than zero. I can tell you, just trying to employ a person, I've found that just employing someone at home, somebody who's 40 years old from Jharkhand, cannot read and write, cannot add and subtract. It is a real problem. But they have mobile phones and they know how to dial numbers. I say, how can you dial a number? You don't know the numbers. Anyway, now the point is, so we've got a problem of those who are 35 to 45 years old, 55 years old, who are illiterate and probably cannot be salvaged. But the young population, even from the poorer states, has basic education. Now, obviously it's not ideal. Now, that coupled with the ecosystem of private universities, this, to me, the private universities that are emerging right across the country are a huge source of hope. The incubator of innovation that is this city is, interestingly, the two cities that, Bangalore and Pune were the two cities that were the Jagirs of Shivaji's father, Shahuji Bhosle was the Jagirdar of Bangalore and Pune. And those two cities, for whatever reason, some historic accident, are real laboratories and incubators of innovation. And I think you're very much part of that story. So I think that there is huge, I mean, I'm very hopeful that, I think it's worth just remembering that service sector innovation has been a huge factor since 1991. I didn't have enough time to get into that, but in the services sector, if you think about what we had prior to 1991, we had one airline that couldn't run properly. We had, I tell you, in the year 1994, we had 7 million telephones in the whole country. I spoke at a conference in New York, I remember, in June 1994, 7 million phones. Now there are 1.2 billion cellular phones, and in urban, interestingly, there are more urban phone subscribers than rural, which suggests that we are a more urbanized country than we used to be. But really, I mean, our own history, if you go back to the Indus Valley civilization, was better planned in terms of urban planning than almost any city in India today is. So
I'm not clear. Are you sanguine about the R&D or not sanguine?
I'm sanguine about the emergence of R&D.
Okay.
I am a little worried about the quality of urban infrastructure that is emerging. Though, again, I see the improvement. I mean, as somebody who's lived outside India for 33 years, the improvement in most of our cities is just stunning. I mean, I drive, I mean, I love taking holidays to Mussoorie and Ranthambore and so on. The roads. When I first traveled to Malaysia in '93, I was just struck by how good the roads were. They're better than the US. And now, I must say, even in Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the Bimaru states, the quality of the roads is world class. So we have an infrastructure situation that is dramatically improved. I mean, the airports.
Before you get to the airports,
when I first went to Ho Chi Minh City had a better airport than any airport in India. And I said, my goodness, I mean, what is this? But that has dramatically changed, and Manmohan Singh deserves a lot of credit for that. So there we are. So we have.
Okay. Yeah. So we're going to turn it over to the audience for some questions, and I think the appropriate theme will be the road ahead. So.
Sure.
Is this working?
Abhijit.
Yeah. So, Mr. Basu, thank you very much for quite a fascinating presentation that gives quite a lot of food for thought, especially the point that you raised about China, its overinvestment, and the untold financial crisis of 2003 that might repeat. But when I listened to your talk, and it was actually a fascinating talk that did trigger some thoughts, one of the parts that did come to my mind is that perhaps we should not dwell so much on the past. As you know, the Deaton, when he did his analysis in terms of computation of GDPs in countries, basically looked at them in terms of population. And the point there was quite clear that in terms of agricultural productivity, if you had more people, you produced more agriculture. So you had an agricultural surplus, it went through. So if you looked at it and you did a parallel thing on China, India, in Roman times or whatever else, you would find that there would be a broad correlation between population and GDP and economic activity. But this has actually changed very remarkably in the last 50 years after the Second World War. And what has now started dominating the world is a question on ideas. And I think that, Narayan, thank you very much for raising this. These are the kind of discussions that lead forward to, you alluded to it, sir, when you talked about the rise of India's service industry, because the service industry is in fact a knowledge industry today. So the real issue that comes forward is that, yes, we have a potential, we have, young population. You didn't emphasize that enough, but there is what it is. And so the future, perhaps, is for India to garner its knowledge. I'm sorry, my question is a little long. The second part of it, which I would actually come around, and I'm not being critical of the present administration or of any administration, the issue is that the focus that we have, and you had touched upon it when you talked about the roads and all of it, is this question of inputs when you talk about infrastructure, when you talk about education, we talk about the number of schools that are built. We're talking about healthcare in terms of insurance availability. But the point that is missing in the link that happens that makes it work is that you actually want to see whether it works. And the point which I have an issue with the current administration is that you do not allow a free and frank evaluation of what the inputs have been and whether we are going in the direction that we should. So this is the part that I sort of look at in a very broader description, and I'm not faulting this administration. Previous administrations have done the same. But if we have to realize our potential, we do have to be critical, we have to be able to assess, and we need to have debate in terms of ideas to go forward. Your views on that, sir?
I think he wants you to talk about the implementation deficit, which is probably more important than the twin deficits we've run.
Yeah, well, I think obviously implementation could be a lot better in a number of areas. But first of all, let me address the knowledge issue. When I compare, having lived in East Asia, when I compare India to, say, Indonesia, it's interesting that in Indonesia, a lot of Indonesian corporates have senior managements that are Indian, even today. And that is because the one thing that India focused on very early on was tertiary education. So the tertiary education endowment that we have today is already quite good. We have what Rajiv Gandhi called a brain deposit in the rest of the world. And we need to tap on that brain deposit and get it to come back. Narayan and I are two examples that have come back. I don't know if we have brains, but whatever. I mean, let's... now the point is that if we can induce them to return, and it's not us alone. If you look at Taiwan, for instance, Taiwan, the entire semiconductor ecosystem, the petrochemicals ecosystem is all built by the returning diaspora. And in fact, China itself grew through the return of the diaspora and trying to attract the diaspora back. So we have perhaps to move in that direction and bring that diaspora back. That's one aspect. So I think in terms of the knowledge factor and building a knowledge economy, I think India has the wherewithal to do that and is generally moving in the right direction there. With regard to the quality of service delivery, we have a problem. And I think my view is that part of the problem is the Constitution. Because the Constitution basically gives very little power of revenue collection to the states. Because the Constitution was actually the Government of India Act of 1935, which was written for British purposes to control the Indians. And so they gave most of the power for delivery of services, education, primary education, healthcare, etc., to the states, but they gave no revenue-raising authority to them. We still have this problem. There's no, so the states are dependent on a transfer of revenue from the center, and that, of course, has been increased by this government. But there really, needs to be a rethink on the nature of our fiscal system so that states have a better capacity to deliver. And I think the good news is that we are seeing some competition among the states, though the fundamental problem of revenue for the states is one of the lacunae. And I think beyond that, this doesn't really apply to the era when the Congress had all the state governments. Right? So during that period, when the Congress had all the state governments, they could have done a lot better. I think there was a problem in the approach to things like universal literacy. India did not want it for some odd reason. And in fact, you still occasionally come across the argument that if you educate them, who's going to do the dirty work? That's sort of nonsense. But
so, PK, if I could just add.
So that I think is changed. Fortunately, I think that's changed. But where we are missing a bit of the implementation side is in state capacity at the state and local government level?
Yeah, I think the next few years, on the second question, I think the next few years we're going to have a fair amount of center-state discussion on, for instance, deficits and how do you address deficits that are quite differential across countries. You know, Punjab and Kerala have a very high deficit, other states don't. All of this is going to come up. Politically, we're going to hit the delimitation at roughly the same time. So these threads are going to intersect, and we're going to have a pretty live debate on the relationship between the center and the state, and we'll see where that heads. But it's related to this implementation question and the separation according to Schedule 7 of the Constitution. I am not as sanguine on the R&D and innovation of this country. I think we have not begun the debate, and any debate in India takes 10 years, and we must begin the debate now, because to be prepared 20 to 25 years from now, we need to solve the structure of incentives for R&D and innovation. And the structure of incentives are misaligned. If you're a careerist innovator, if that's not an oxymoron, I mean, it's just two incompatible terms. We have careerist innovators, and that doesn't work. It works for adapting and for modifying existing technology. It doesn't work for creating new things. And so we really have to get our act together on that. A couple more questions before Ravi tells me that we have to end on time as well. Please.
I'll just speak up.
Yeah, and I'll repeat if everybody can't hear. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was somewhat surprised that you did not touch on the regional imbalance. So whatever was there in the south, we can replicate it in the north, right, and break away. So maybe I'm being simplistic, but no. Obviously, we have figured out something with the same laws, same center-state problems, same issues, customs, whatever you can say, and we have done well in the south. So just why don't we just take that and repeat it in the north? So to say that all the institutions are independent, I felt it was a bit simplistic. I feel India is more like Europe. I feel that we should deal with India like the way we deal with Europe. That is one observation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Should we take the next?
Yeah, why don't we take the next question as well, please?
Thank you. So in a slightly different tack, so you mentioned Europe. We often talk about India in context of Europe or China. I wonder about the ASEAN comparison, right? I mean, India is a big country. Flawed comparison, but if maybe a Maharashtra is equivalent to a Malaysia, UP is equivalent to a Indonesia, I wonder, given the sort of, if you aggregate, like take all the 10 ASEAN states and look at India, we're looking at a $3 to $4 trillion GDP, right? To what extent do you think an India-ASEAN comparison is really tenable? And do you think they're fundamentally rivalrous, or do you think there's a lot of scope for, yes, mutual collaboration? Sorry, that's a...
Yeah, very interesting questions both. So with regard to Europe, I think if you think about Europe in the Roman Empire, Europe was one. So there have been periods in the past when Europe was a single entity. Similarly, with ASEAN, there have been periods in the past when most of ASEAN was a single civilization. But the diversity that you see in ASEAN is very similar to what you see in India. There are some states, some nations in ASEAN like Laos and Myanmar, Burma, that are as poor as some of the poorest parts of India. There isn't a Singapore in India. I mean, Singapore is a fully developed economy. I don't think Mumbai is a Singapore. So you don't quite have that. But as you said, I think you could argue that parts of Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, Telangana rather, today, would be similar to Malaysia. So there is, I think, now the point is that the fact that we have a single nation state is a huge advantage, and there will be periods when some parts do better. I think the fact that the South was culturally more whole and less subject to the depredations that the North was through history has helped give it a coherence that some of the northern parts of India don't quite have, and has reduced some of the conflicts that the North has to a much greater extent. But the point is that if you have if you look at, say, the United States, after the Civil War, before the Civil War in the United States, 1861 to 65, before that, the South was agricultural and produced primarily cotton for the British textile industry. After 1865, the South became much more of an industrial economy because that's where the cheaper labor was. And so over long periods of time, these sorts of things happen. And the fact that we have a single country, now, despite having a single country, we didn't have a single national GST, goods and services tax system. We had different octroys and so on. So we didn't actually have a single national market properly. We have moved in that direction. I'd say about the GST, everywhere else in the world, there is a single rate of GST. India has 5, and we have hundreds of exceptions. Because I think this is one of the problems with having a bureaucracy that always wants its hand in the pie and wants discretionary power. I think it's really foolish to have such a complicated tax system. One of our problems at the moment is an extremely complicated personal income tax system. I just discovered it when I started filing my taxes last year and this. Way more complicated than anywhere else in the world, way more. And then there's the GST, which is ridiculous. I mean, every country that has a GST has a single rate. Why do we have 5? And why do we have so many exceptions? I mean, it's absurd. So some of these things can be easily addressed with a more coherent debate. But the answer on this is going to be, it's a very complicated federal system, GST council makes the decisions, not the central government, etc. Okay, whatever that is, but the fundamental problem was at the inception. At the inception, they came up with 5 and so many exceptions. So I think there are some of these self-goals can be set right quite quickly if we have a rational debate. But it's not that easy to have a rational debate in an obstreperous democracy like ours.
I think both European Union and ASEAN are relevant comparisons to India, but from both a good and bad point of view. For instance, the biggest reaction to the European Union is the lack of ease of doing a business, hence Brexit and now Frexit and all of these other things coming up. So the gumming up of the system, which you're calling self-goals, but we do regularly, is a very important aspect of what we shouldn't be doing, and that we can borrow from some aspects of ASEAN. But ASEAN has a reverse problem, that it is equivalent to the European Common Market, which is the predecessor to the European Union, but it does not have political and monetary union. And when you don't have political and monetary union, then you have very different set of, basic macroeconomic conditions within which to operate, basic educational systems within to operate, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes more complicated. So India, in that sense, is fortunate to have one union region that enforces this. One more question, and then...
Interestingly, on that, 2 other countries are part of India's monetary union, Nepal and Bhutan. We don't quite realize this, but Nepal is actually as much part of India as any part of the any member of the European Union is. We have complete labor mobility, capital mobility. We basically have a full common market, and of course the currency is not exactly. The currency is not exactly in a union with India, but otherwise, it's a full common market, but without the currency. And Bhutan includes the currency. The Bhutanese Nultram is the Indian rupee.
Last question, please go ahead.
Thank you for the good discussions. So my question is, what would be the right, good, practical mix of formal, informal economies, and how can we get it there quickly?
Well, I think we need much more of a formal economy over time, and we're moving quite rapidly in that direction. If you look at the numbers, I'd say that when the census is done, we'll find that perhaps
Sorry,
close.
when will the census be done?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's already rather late. So hopefully the census will be done in 2023, maybe 20. Anyway, yeah. When the next census is done, I think we'll find that the organized sector is already well over 20%, probably closer to 25%. And, we have that already in the EPFO numbers, etc. So that's improving. But what I also want to see is the informal sector needs to be somewhat better regulated. It needs to become less informal. And that too is slowly happening. So some countries survive with a large informal sector, like Spain, for instance. 25 to 30% of the Spanish economy is informal, etc. But it is not a condition to be celebrated. To have a very large informal sector is, you can say it's jugaad and the Indian way and all of these things, but I think that is a lack of institutionalization that is more of a problem. And the quicker we can expand the organized, formal sector, the better it'll be. And the best way to do it, in my view, if I didn't spell it out, let me spell it out again, is to have a labor-intensive manufacturing revolution, which we have skipped. We've skipped it repeatedly, and in every decade you find economists coming up with new. The latest justification is that labor-intensive manufacturing is passé, and we are now in the fourth industrial revolution, and we have 4D printing, so there will not be. Please go to Vietnam and look at, Samsung has 800,000 workers in Vietnam. Just one country, one company. So labor-intensive manufacturing is far from dead, and there is still a huge opportunity that we're not taking advantage of. China still exports 8 times as much of textiles and garments as India does. So there is that opportunity. If we can get to half of China's size, that will create 100 million jobs.
We'll leave that as the benediction. Thank you.